This video is going to explain page 11 and 12 of your book. Like previous videos, I'm going to explain the difficult vocabulary first, and then I'll talk about the plot and characters. Let's start. Page 11 of your book. So Inspector Gould just arrived, and Edna went to answer the door. Let's take a look at these words. The first one's purposefulness. Purposefulness. It means very firm and decisive. Decisive. It is a word used to describe Inspector Gould. It means that Inspector Gould is a person who is very good at making decisions, and he is very firm about his own opinion and stance. Okay, and then the next word is massiveness. Massiveness. It means heavy, bulky, big. So this line says the inspector needs not to be a big man. So he doesn't need to be big, but his image, his impression needs to be big, heavy, and bulky. So a very strong build. Take a look at number 7 first. Solidity. Solidity. So like massiveness, purposefulness, solidity, this word is also used to describe the inspector. It means strong and have strength. So based on these 3 words, we know that the inspector is a person who looks very big, strong, and a very smart person who can make wise decisions. And then the book continues to describe the inspector. It says he is in his 50s, dressed in a plain, darkish suit. So plain here means very simple, basic, no decoration. So his suit is very simple, just dark, one color. That's it. And then you can look at the word number 4, weightily. Weightily. It is used to describe the way he speaks. So it means that weightily means it is heavy, the speech is heavy, and is in a very serious tone. So the inspector speaks very carefully and seriously. And then the next word, number 6. Let's take a look at number 6 first. Disconcerting habit. So disconcerting means making people feel very uncomfortable. So the inspector has this habit to look at people and make people feel very uncomfortable because he looks hard. Number 3, the phrase, okay, looking hard. It means he looks intensely, and that makes people feel very uncomfortable. So these are the meanings of these words. And then the story continues. There are 3 words here in this part that I want you to pay attention to. Number 1, whiskey. Whiskey. I've already taught you what port is, okay? Port is a Portuguese wine, is a dessert wine. It's sweet. You enjoy it after dinner. But it's different from whiskey. Whiskey is a kind of alcohol that is stronger. And normally when men talk, they enjoy a glass of a little whiskey, okay? And then the second word, transferred. Transferred. It means the inspector changes from working from one place to another place. So it's recently transferred. So the inspector was originally from another police station and recently transferred and changed to this town. The next word, alderman. Alderman. It is an officer in the town. It's a city council member. So he is a guy who actually works for the town and helps making decisions about the development and also the normal running of the city. Basically, it's a position before you become a mayor. A mayor. The chief officer of the town. And that's alderman. Alderman. Then the inspector explained why he was here. Here are some words that I want you to know. Number 1, infirmary. Infirmary. It means a small hospital and clinic. And number 2, the phrase burn her inside out. Inside out. Because the girl has swallowed a lot of disinfectant. And that's why those disinfectant hurt her so badly. And she would have a burning feel inside her stomach. So burn her inside out means it was really painful for her. Okay, let's take a look at number 6 first. Number 6, Disinfectant. Disinfectant is cleansing agent to help kill bacteria, germs. Basically, they're chemicals that you wouldn't drink. And the lady swallowed a lot to kill herself. And then when Eric heard this piece of news, you can see from the stage direction the word involuntarily. Involuntarily means you cannot control yourself. So without any thinking, Eric immediately said, "Oh my God." Okay? And then the next word, agony. Number 3, okay, agony. It means suffering, pain. So after drinking the disinfectant, the lady was in great pain. And the last word, number 5, suicide. It means killing oneself. So the girl drank the disinfectant to kill herself. Okay, let's take a look at these words. Number 1, horrid business. So when Mr. Berling heard the news, he agreed that it was a very horrible business. Horrid means horrible. And then number 2, the stage direction, cutting through. It means the person moves quickly through something. So very likely the inspector was standing in between people, and during Mr. Berling's speech, the inspector interrupted and walked through those people. Maybe it was Eric or Gerald. It's a stage direction telling the inspector where to move, okay? Cutting through. And then the next word, thoughtfully. It means like someone is thinking. So when the inspector asked Mr. Berling whether he knew who Eva Smith was, Mr. Berling was thinking. That was the stage direction for him. And the last word, convey. It means bring or carry. But here, Mr. Berling says, it doesn't convey anything to me. So the name doesn't bring anything to Mr. Berling, implying that he didn't remember Eva Smith because the name didn't bring any memory to him. So this is the meaning of convey. And then the last part on page 12, these are the words that I want you to take a look. Number 1, ordinary. When Mr. Berling said that he didn't remember Eva Smith, Inspector described Eva Smith as out of the ordinary. Ordinary, this word means normal, very normal, typical. But according to the inspector's description, out of the ordinary means Eva Smith wasn't normal. She was not a typical girl. She was special. And then the second word, interposes. It means standing between. So the inspector stood between Eric and Gerald, and that was his stage direction. And then the next word, let's take a look at number 4 first, annoyed. It means irritated, a little bit angry. So when Mr. Berling didn't let Eric and Gerald look at the photo, and he stood in between Eric and Gerald, a little bit rude, Eric and Gerald were annoyed. They were a little bit angry, a little bit irritated. And Mr. Berling stares hard. This is what it says in the stage direction. Stares means looking intensely. So looking at a person without blinking, without changing direction, very focused. Look intensely. And the last 2 words, inquiry, and muddle. Inquiry means asking for information. So the inspector was here to investigate about Eva Smith's suicide case. Of course, he needed to ask for information. So inquiry means asking for information. And the last word, muddle. It means confusion. So this is how the inspector explained that he didn't like showing the photo to everyone. He liked to ask questions one by one because he didn't want to cause any confusion. So muddle. And then the last little part on page 13, Mr. Berling said, I see, sensible really. So sensible means a correct decision, a wise decision. It makes sense. And then he moves restlessly. So here it means Mr. Berling was feeling very uncomfortable because he knew that the inspector wasn't here for a warrant, but to investigate the whole family about the suicide case. So he was feeling uncomfortable, restlessly. Okay, so I've explained all the vocabulary. Now let me quickly talk about the plot and the characters. So on page 11, let's go back to page 11. The inspector arrived, and Edna answered the door. So this is the first time for the audience to see the inspector. So in the play script, there is this description about the inspector to let the actor and actress know how this inspector should look like and what kind of person the inspector should be. So there is this stage direction and description for the character. And from this paragraph, we've learned that the inspector was in his 50s, so he was as old as Mr. Burling. And this is a piece of very important information because the inspector was at a similar age as Mr. Burling. That's why in terms of life experience, in terms of authority and power, the inspector could talk to Mr. Burling without a lot of manner. And the inspector didn't care that much. He just tried to do his job. And then the description about the appearance of the inspector, the words massiveness, solidity, purposefulness are used. They all mean that this inspector was strong, looked heavy, bulky, and seems like a very smart and determined guy who can make decisions wisely and very firmly. And then in terms of the way he speaks, the inspector speaks carefully, weightily, and looks at people before he talks to them in a very serious manner. So based on these descriptions, we've learned that this inspector is a very serious person and looks like he has the power and authority to investigate the case, and that's why people should be scared of him when he asks questions. And based on the description of his outfit, the clothes that he wears, it was only a plain darkish suit. So this implies that he was actually from a middle working class only, and he wasn't wearing any fancy clothes. So this is what we've learned from this description. And then the inspector started talking to Mr. Burling, and before they talked, Mr. Burling offered the inspector a glass of port or a little whiskey. So you can see how Mr. Burling normally treated police officers that he knew, is to offer wine to show that he was friendly. It was a casual, social chat. But to the inspector, he rejected. He said that he was on duty. That's why he couldn't drink alcohol. So from this line, we can see that this inspector was actually different from other normal inspectors or other police officers. And because of this, Mr. Burling knew that this inspector was different, and probably he was new and didn't know about the rules or relationships in this town. And the inspector admitted that he was only recently transferred from another town or another police station, that Mr. Burling might not know about him. And then Mr. Burling tried to explain that he was an older man, he was a mayor, and then he was now working at the law court, and saying that he should know everyone in Bromley police office. Why did Mr. Burling say this? What do you think? If the inspector was new, why did Mr. Burling need to explain his positions or titles 2 years ago? Let me tell you. Mr. Burling was trying to say all these because he wanted to show his authority in this town and his position and social status in this town, and trying to threaten the inspector, showing that Mr. Burling had good relationship with all the important people in the town. It was sort of like giving a warning to this new inspector, to ask the inspector to be careful to deal with him. However, look at the inspector's reaction. He simply said, "Quite so." Because the inspector didn't show any friendliness to Mr. Burling, so Mr. Burling replied seriously, asking whether this inspector was here to ask for a warrant. I've explained this word in previous video already. Warrant means an official document that a police need to take action, to arrest people or to search someone's house. And remember, in the previous part, we've already said that Mr. Berlin was going to receive a knighthood very likely, and without any scandal or without anything wrong, he would have received the knighthood. So before he saw the inspector, before Mr. Berlin saw the inspector, he thought that this inspector was just here to get a warrant because he was still on the bench, so working for some law cases. However, the inspector replied, "No, Mr. Berlin." That actually kind of frightened Mr. Berlin too, because if it's not for a warrant, then it must be something else that was serious, and the inspector was here really to investigate. And you can also see that the tone of the inspector was pretty cold and rude. To Mr. Berlin, it must be very weird, because even Mr. Berlin's family was from a middle class, but definitely they should be from an upper middle class, so almost to the upper class. Compared to the working class, middle class, the inspector was actually one class lower than Mr. Berlin comparatively. So if someone from a lower class talked to you like that rudely and coldly, you would probably feel annoyed and found it weird, right? So that's why when the inspector said he wasn't here for a warrant, Mr. Berlin was a little bit impatient, and then the inspector explained why he was here, and that's when the story begins. He explained that a young woman died in the afternoon by drinking a lot of strong disinfectant, so making her feeling very painful, and the girl was trying to kill herself. After the inspector said this, Eric immediately couldn't control himself and uttered the words, "My God." So that was Eric's reaction. And you can see that when Eric heard about someone dying, and he didn't even know this girl yet, he still showed his sympathy. So you can see that Eric was this kind of person, quite sympathetic, having compassion towards others. It's not like Mr. Berlin or Mrs. Berlin being very cold and distant. And so the inspector continued to say, yes, the girl died in agony, very painful. And Mr. Berlin's reaction was totally opposite to Eric's one. Even Mr. Berlin said, yeah, it was horrible. But still, he didn't understand why the inspector was there. Mr. Berlin didn't care about the girl. He cared about himself, whether he was in trouble. And then the inspector explained that in the lady's room, she found a letter, a diary. Remember these 2 points, very important, because the letter and the diary explained the rest of the story. An inspector described the girl as these young women who got into different kinds of trouble. So what kind of women was the inspector referring? He was actually referring to the lower class women. And women by that time weren't treated equally as men. And the inspector explained that lower class women like Eva used more than one name, but her real name was Eva Smith, okay? And the inspector asked whether Mr. Berlin remembered. You could see that actually Mr. Berlin remembered. He might know, but he was trying to deny, because from the stage direction, slowly, he said, "No, I seem to remember hearing the name somewhere, but it doesn't mean anything to me, and I don't see how this is related to me." This is what he said, because he knew that if he admitted something, he might be in trouble. That's why he was trying to deny. And the inspector tried to explain, saying Eva was one of Mr. Berlin's employees. And then Mr. Berlin immediately had an excuse. He said he had several hundred young women working for him. So from this line, we know that Mr. Berlin actually owned a very big company, because there were a lot of people working for him. And then because Mr. Berlin denied knowing her, so the inspector tried to show Mr. Berlin the photo. And at that time, Joe and Eric wanted to see the photo as well, but the inspector rejected showing them. This action was actually pretty rude, and that's why Eric and Joe felt annoyed. And so Joe questioned the inspector why he couldn't see the photo. and Eric questioned as well. And the inspector explained that was how he worked, showing the evidence to one person at a time and only ask questions to one person at a time. If not, he felt like it was very confusing. This part is actually pretty important because at the end of the play, in Act 3, you will know that the way how the inspector worked actually affects the whole story. And you'll learn it in Act 3 and we'll explain it later. After the inspector explained how he worked, then Mr. Berlin said it was logical, okay, it made sense, but at the same time, he felt uncomfortable. He started to be worried that there would be some scandal that may affect his knighthood. And then Mr. Berlin also said to Eric, "You've had enough of that port." So why would Mr. Berlin suddenly stop Eric from drinking more alcohol? It's because Mr. Berlin was aware that the whole family might be in trouble. So he needed to make sure everyone was not drunk when they answered the inspector's questions to avoid making any trouble. Okay? So that's the end of these 2 pages. It only explains how it looks like when the inspector arrived. If you have anything that you still don't understand, please rewatch the video or ask me questions. Thank you.